So today's Reformation Sunday, and we tend to take time today to remember Martin Luther and life in 1517 and all of that sort of thing. And I thought initially that I would honor that day by giving you a Luther-length sermon. That should last about an hour. And so if you're ready, I could go for an hour on this topic without even trying. But I won't, because I'm sure we have 1 o'clock kickoff to get home to. Reformation is basically known for its theology. We tend to think about that on a day like this. We think about how Martin Luther sought to reform the church of his day. About how he sought to change the way the church taught, especially about salvation. And Luther had this breakthrough when he read a piece of scripture that the church in his day pretty much paid no attention to. That would be the book of Romans. The medieval church had no use for Paul. They didn't like him. They didn't appreciate him. They never read his stuff. Luther went back and read it and said, wow, this is good stuff. Because in the days of the medieval church, salvation was basically your job. You had to do all of the right things. You had to obey all of the laws, and believe me, there were lots of them. And when you didn't obey one of those laws, when you broke one of the commandments, when you committed a sin, it was your obligation to go to the priest and confess it. And then you were responsible for doing your penance so that you might then finally, after all that you had done, be forgiven for that one sin. And you had to do that for every single sin you ever committed, ever. Now, what are the odds of doing that? Pretty slim, I would imagine. But that was the culture. That was the system of the medieval church. It was your job to appease the angry God who was seeking to smite you down for all of the other sins that you never confessed and weren't forgiven for. And oh, by the way, this gracious and loving God did provide one extra option for you. He called it purgatory, where you could burn off all those sins you didn't atone for in life. Luther didn't like that system because he understood that you could never accomplish it. You could never appease the angry God. And you could never be saved. He was bothered by that until he read Romans, and specifically until he read the passage we heard this morning, where Paul writes, we are told, behold, that a person is justified by faith, apart from works prescribed by the law. We are saved not by what we do or what we try to do or what we think we are able to do. We are saved by what God does. God sent Jesus. It is a graceful gift of the loving God that is sufficient. God has acted in Jesus Christ, and we are freed from the burden of having to make ourselves worthy to be near God, because God has come near to us and done all the work for us. It is God who restores and heals our broken relationship with God. It has nothing to do with what we do. It has everything to do with what God does. The parable that Jesus tells is a perfect illustration. Because the Pharisee stands before God in prayer and basically recites how wonderful He is. And all of the ways that He is obeying the law. And all the ways that He is doing all of these righteous things. And standing near to Him as a tax collector. A schlub. A schmuck. A fallen man. A traitor. An outcast. As low as you can get. And all he can do is throw himself on the mercy of God. All he can do is plead for God's grace and mercy and love and forgiveness. And Jesus says that's good, because that's what it takes. And it's the tax collector who goes home with a right relationship with God, because he has done the right thing. He has thrown himself on the mercy of God. He has pleaded for grace, and he knows that God is gracious and merciful. And grace will be granted to him. And that is the theological breakthrough that Martin Luther achieved, brought forth in the Reformation. That is not at all what I want to focus on today. I told you it's going on for an hour, folks. Because besides reforming the church theologically, Luther also had another task. He wanted to reform society. Because he understood that the church governed society. And as much as he thought that the church was theologically wrong, he also thought that the church was socially wrong. The church was basically another one of those feudal medieval institutions that oppressed people. It set onerous government rules and tasks and obligations upon them. It held down people. It perpetuated poverty. by holding up a system where, again, you had nothing and the church had everything, and what you did have, you owed to the church. The church was simply another corrupt king. And he wanted to change that. He wanted to reform society. Not only does the gospel free us from worrying about appeasing God, it also frees us from coercive government, and it frees us from an old system that oppressed and held down the majority of people in his day. And I want to talk to you about a specific way in which this was enacted. A specific way that Luther's Reformation changed the world and changed society and changed how the world operated and brought about freedom for people. It is a subject near and dear to my heart, and it is one I have focused a lot of time and energy studying. Beer. Brendan, there will be a quiz. You see, in Luther's day, beer was a standard drink. Every household made beer. It was the job of the wife to make beer. You could look at her now. It was the job of the wife to brew beer. Now, that sounds like a pretty simple thing, and how could the church be involved in that? Well, it was simple. The substance you used to season and flavor your beer was something called gruit. Let me tell you what gruit was. It was a mixture of herbs and botanicals. For example, sweet gale, mugwort, yarrow, ground ivy, heather, rosemary, juniper berries, ginger, and cinnamon. How's that sound? Well, that's what it was. That's how you brewed beer. And the thing was, the church controlled access to gruit. It controlled access to it. You couldn't get it unless you got it through the church, and you had to pay a tax in order to acquire this stuff to make your beer. The church got its cut. And Luther thought that was wrong. That's not something the church ought to be involved in. It was a form of corruption. So his advice was don't use it. You know, if somebody is using an oppressive and onerous tax on a good or a purchase item that you want, you don't want to pay it, don't buy it. Well, what do? I mean, goodness gracious, Luther had to have his beer. What could you use in place of gruit to season and flavor your beer? Well, he used a weed. He suggested, and they did, they used a weed because weeds were free. And it was a very specific weed that grew everywhere in Germany. You could just go out and pick it anywhere you wanted because it was all over the place. And that weed is called hops. That's right, Brendan. Because of Martin Luther, you have IPAs. Hops was free. Now, aside from making a political statement, that also is a social statement. Because again, hops was untaxed. And you freed yourself from a corrupting power of government and the church. But, it did more than that. Hops is a better preservative. Hops meant your beer would last longer. It would stay fresher longer. And you know what that meant? You could sell it. And you could transport it. And all of a sudden, beer becomes a way to make a living and free yourself from that feudal system that binds you and everything you own to an overlord. Because all of a sudden, you're in control and you can market your product. And you can take your product and ship it somewhere. And you can send it by cart, and it'll make it to the next town, and it'll be good. And all of a sudden, you start having some economic freedom. And all of a sudden, you start having self-determination. And all of a sudden, you start having a say in your own life. And you start raising your standard of living. And you start acquiring a better household and a better future and better opportunities because now you're in control. Because you like hops. Because you picked a weed and used it. Luther was actually stressing freedom, theologically and societally. The theological freedom, of course, is the freedom that comes from the grace of God and knowing that it's not up to us. We're free from worrying about that. And so because we are free from worrying about our need to earn our own salvation, we are now free to go about working in the world and improving our station in life and improving the world around us. And Luther focused endlessly on freedom. Not just economic freedom, educational freedom. Luther was one of the first proponents of universal literacy. He thought everybody should be able to read. Specifically one book, the Bible. He felt that the Bible should be everyone's book. That you should be free to read it for yourself and not have to trust some pastoral or priestly authority to tell you what it said and tell you what it meant and tell you how to understand it and tell you what was important or not important. You could decide that for yourself because you could hold that book in your hand and you could read it for yourself. But that meant you had to have education. And guess who controlled education in the medieval world? That's right, the church. And guess what? They limited who could have access to it. Luther was one of the first people to come along and propose free public education for all. Men and women. Boys and girls. That was unheard of. Girls did not need education. Girls did not need anything because in the medieval church, girls didn't have souls. So they didn't count for anything. Luther said that's a bunch of garbage. Girls are powerful and girls are welcome and they have souls and they have everything that a man has, so they deserve everything a man should have. So they should be educated and they should have a right to earn a living and they should have a right to prosper and be independent. They should not be confined to a convent or their husband forever and ever. They should have freedom too. So he held up education for all. And he held up literacy for all. Because what he really wanted was for people to think and reflect for themselves on everything. And not simply blindly believe and follow what some authority tells you is so. He wanted freedom of mind, freedom of soul, freedom of income. He wanted a free society. He wanted a freedom that allowed you to engage in a life of personal integrity. Freedom to be honest. Freedom to be truthful. He took the sixth commandment, which says, "Thou shalt not steal," and he expanded it to say that includes don't sell shoddy merchandise. And don't gouge your price. Don't charge an unfair price, because that's stealing too. And you should be a person of integrity. He held up human rights. He held up that the voice and the conscience and the rights of the individual triumphed over the rights of government power and government authority because he wanted people to be free. He believed in personal enterprise, determining your own future, the freedom to do the job that you want, not the job that's been assigned to you from generations before. To earn a decent living and provide for your family and not live in squalor and poverty. He was a super hard proponent of a burgeoning middle class. He wanted to change society and free people for the betterment of those people. Because he felt that they were being oppressed and held in bondage. We were held in bondage to sin. We were held in bondage by oppressive government and oppressive authority. And he wanted people to be free. Because he said that's what the gospel is. It frees people. It frees people theologically by freeing them from guilt and fear. From that guilt and fear that says, I'm not good enough. Says, I cannot do it all. Say, I know you can't, but God did it all for you. So you're free from sin. You're free from death. Because God has claimed you. And God has spoken that word for you. And because God has spoken to free you by faith, you can now go out and have a free society. You're now free to determine your own life. Determine your own future. Determine your own path. Reformation Sunday is not simply about remembering what Martin Luther did on October 31st, 1517. It's about remembering that that's an ongoing task of reforming. The church needs reforming today. Society needs reforming today just as much as it did back then. We are his heirs, and we are his descendants, and we are the continuation of his Reformation. And it is our task to continue that reforming work theologically by not only talking about grace and mercy and forgiveness and love, but by living it and making it the core of how we behave and how we treat one another and how we treat all people, recognizing that God's grace and mercy and forgiveness and love are unconditional, and so should ours. Our grace and mercy and forgiveness and love should be unconditional as well. And we should preach a gospel of welcome and healing to all people, so that all people can be blessed and all people can be saved. And we need to continue to improve society as well, the other half of Luther's Reformation. We need to continue to work to improve work choices and work opportunities for all people, so that all people can determine their own future and determine their own path and not be bound and enslaved to a system or a government or a corporation or anything else. We need to improve freedom for all people so that we can make those choices for ourselves and have a life of opportunity and peace and security. And we need to raise up all people so that all people are free from all the bonds of fear and oppression and hatred that govern so much of our world. The Reformation goes on through us and in us, because the work is never done. The world continues to need reform. The church continues to need reform, and we are the agents of that, because we have been blessed, and we have known that grace and that love. We feel the freedom of God inside of us. Luther spoke of freedom for all. Live that freedom and continue to be the Reformation and have a beer.
Amen.